path to peace in Ukraine. Both leaders insisted that progress was made, but neither offered any details. Trump, speaking to reporters after the nearly 3-hour meeting, said, "We didn't get there," and repeated his line that there's no deal until there's a deal. He nevertheless claimed the talks were productive, calling them a 10 out of 10 and saying he believed a deal was still possible. Putin struck a similarly optimistic tone, declaring he was sincerely interested in ending the conflict, but provided no roadmap for how that would happen. Both leaders surprised observers by delivering statements without taking any questions from any journalists. Their delegations also left the room immediately afterwards, leaving many outstanding issues unanswered. In a Fox News interview recorded just after the summit, Trump floated the possibility of a prisoner swap, saying he had been presented with a list of thousands of names. He added that land swaps and territorial arrangements had also been discussed, calling the meeting with Putin very warm and suggesting they were pretty close to a deal. Yet, Trump also stressed that any agreement would depend on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who was not invited to the summit. Trump urged him to make a deal while saying future talks would need to include both Putin and Zelensky, along with European partners. Reactions have been mixed. Former US Ambassador to NATO, Douglas Lutte, called the outcome a gain for Putin, who secured the prestige of sharing the stage with the American president, while Trump walked away with 0. Analysts say the lack of substance leaves the war's future uncertain, with Kyiv still silent and no new steps announced to halt the fighting. The red carpet greeting in Anchorage, complete with 2 handshakes, a motorcade ride in Trump's limousine, and a backdrop reading "Pursuing Peace," may have provided drama, but for now the substance remains elusive and the war in Ukraine continues. Before we move on, let's cut across to the press conference held by the Russian president and the United States President Donald Trump in Alaska.
President of the United States of America and the President of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, our negotiations have been held in a constructive atmosphere of mutual respect. We have very thorough negotiations that were quite useful. I would like to thank once again my American counterpart for the proposal to travel out here to Alaska. It only makes sense that we've met here because our countries, though separated by the oceans, are close neighbors. So when we've met, when I came out of the plane and I've said, "Good afternoon, dear neighbor. Very good to see you. In good health and to see you alive." I think that is very neighborly. And I think that's some kind words that we can say to each other. We're separated by the Strait of Bering, though there are 2 islands only between the Russian island and the U.S. island. They're only 4 kilometers apart. We're close neighbors, and it's a fact. It's also important that Alaska has to do with our common heritage, common history between Russia and the U.S., and many positive events have to do with that territory. Still, there is tremendous cultural heritage back from the Russian America. For example, Orthodox churches and a lot of more than 700 geographical names of Russian origin. During the Second World War, it was here in Alaska that was the origin of the legendary air bridge for the supply of military aircraft and other equipment under the Lend-Lease program. There was a dangerous and treacherous route over the vast emptiness of ice. However, the pilots of both countries did everything to bring closer the victory. They risked their lives and they gave it all for the common victory. I was just in the city of Magadan in Russia, and there is a memorial there dedicated to the Russian and the U.S. pilots. and there are two flags, the U.S. flag and the Russian flag. And I know that here as well, there is such a memorial. There is a military burial place several kilometers away from here. The Soviet pilots that buried there who died during that dangerous mission. We're thankful to the citizens and the government of the U.S. for carefully taking care of their memory. I think that's very worthy and noble. We'll always remember other historical examples when our countries defeated common enemies together in the spirit of battle camaraderie and allyship that supported each other and facilitated each other. I'm sure that this heritage will help us rebuild and foster mutually beneficial and equal ties at this new stage, even during the hardest conditions. It is known that there have been no summits between Russia and the U.S. for 4 years, and that's a long time. This time was very hard for bilateral relations, and let's be frank, they have fallen to the lowest point since the Cold War. I think that's not benefiting our countries and the world as a whole. It is apparent that sooner or later we had to amend the situation to move on from the confrontation to dialogue. And in this case, a personal meeting between the heads of state has been long overdue. Naturally, under the condition of serious and painstaking work, and this work has been done in general. Me and President Trump have very good direct contact. We've spoken multiple times. We spoke frankly on the phone. And Special Envoy of the President, Mr. Witkoff, traveled out to Russia several times. Our advisors and heads of foreign ministries kept in touch all the time. And you know fully well that one of the central issues was the situation around Ukraine. We see the strive of the administration and President Trump personally to help facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. And his strive to get to the crux of the matter, to understand this history, is precious. As I've said, the situation in Ukraine has to do with fundamental threats to our security. Moreover, we've always considered the Ukrainian nation, and I've said it multiple times, a brotherly nation, however strange it may sound in these conditions. We have the same roots, and everything that's happening is a tragedy for us and terrible wound. Therefore, the country is sincerely interested in putting an end to it. At the same time, we're convinced that in order to make the settlement lasting and long-term, we need to eliminate all the primary roots, the primary causes of that conflict. And we've said it multiple times, to consider all legitimate concerns of Russia and to reinstate a just balance of security in Europe and in the world on the whole. And I agree with President Trump, as he has said today, that naturally the security of Ukraine should be ensured as well. Naturally, we are prepared to work on that. I would like to hope that the agreement that we've reached together will help us bring closer that goal and will pave the path towards peace in Ukraine. We expect that Kyiv and European capitals will perceive that constructively and that they won't throw a wrench in the works. They will not make any attempts to use some backroom dealings to conduct provocations to torpedo the nascent progress. Incidentally, when the new administration came to power, bilateral trade started to grow. It's still very symbolic. Still, we have a growth of 20%. As I've said, we have a lot of dimensions for joint work. It is clear that the U.S. and Russian investment and business cooperation has tremendous potential. Russia and the U.S. can offer each other so much in trade, digital, high-tech, and in space exploration. We see that Arctic cooperation is also very possible, and our international context, for example, between the Far East of Russia and the West Coast of the U.S. Overall, it's very important for our countries to turn the page, to go back to cooperation. It is symbolic that not far away from here, at the border between Russia and the U.S., there is a so-called international date line. I think you can step over, literally, from yesterday into tomorrow. And I hope that we'll succeed in that, in political sphere. I would like to thank President Trump for our joint work, for the well-wishing and trustworthy tone of our conversation. It's important that both sides are result-oriented, and we see that the President of the U.S. has a very clear idea of what he would like to achieve.
Now let's move on to some more coverage of this significant geopolitical event. In a televised interview filmed right after the summit ended, Trump spoke to Fox News on a range of topics from his discussions with Putin. Let's take a listen in.
So did you have alone time with him?
Yeah, I did. I did actually after our speeches. He made a very good speech, and I also finished it up. And afterwards, we spoke. Right after that, we spoke very sincerely. I think he wants to see it done. I want to see if we can get it done. You know, it's not a done deal at all. They're going to set up a meeting now between President Zelensky and President Putin. And myself, I guess, you know, I didn't ask you about it. Not that I want to be there, but I want to make sure it gets done. And we agreed on a lot of points. I mean, a lot of points we agreed on. But there's not that much. There's, you know, one or two pretty significant items, but I think they can be reached. Now it's really up to President Zelensky to get it done. And I would also say the European nations, they have to get involved a little bit.
There's going to be some land swaps. There will be more Russian territory than there had been. And what Ukraine wants and needs desperately is our security measures that won't be NATO related. If you had to look into your crystal ball, is that how it ends?
Well, I think those are points that we negotiated, and those are points that we largely have agreed on, actually. I think we're pretty close to a deal. Now, look, Ukraine has to agree to it. Maybe they'll say no.
India doesn't buy your oil. The European Union won't buy it. And why in the back of my head was I thinking, wait a minute, Donald Trump just delayed a possible increase in tariffs on China. Why do I think that probably President Trump was thinking ahead that maybe if you had to, that would have been part of the consequences?
Well, because of what happened today, I think I don't have to think about that. Now, I may have to think about it in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or something, but we don't have to think about that right now. I think the meeting went very well.
We're now joined by Gautam Mukherjee, who's a senior reporter from New Delhi, to discuss this further. Gautam, thank you very much for joining us, as always. People around the world, Gautam, stayed up, had all their eyes on this meeting, a meeting that has been built up for the past 6 months, where Donald Trump had previously said he was going to end this war within 24 hours. He has not done so. However, things were looking up for this meeting. Donald Trump's language was firm against the Russian president, saying that he wanted a ceasefire from this meeting with Putin in Alaska. We, however, have not got that. Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin seemed all smiles, and the interview that he just gave to Fox News seems to be shifting the blame over to Zelensky, throwing the ball over into his court, if you will. It's saying that Zelensky must take now responsibility for a peace deal with Russia. Of course, a positive here is the fact that a trilateral meeting seems to be on the horizon with the accompaniment of European powers. Can I get your stance, your analysis on your opinion on the meeting that occurred last night and the possible outcomes of it?
Well, Thomas, I think we're on our way to a settlement and a stoppage of the Russian-Ukrainian war. What has happened in Anchorage, Alaska, is a broad agreement on the land swap. I think Putin is quite happy with Trump's reactions on the areas he wishes to keep after a war of 3 years, which has cost him over 1 million dead on the Russian side, and enormous cost as well as destruction of military equipment. Remember, as far as Europe and NATO goes, they are fighting a proxy war. The people who are getting killed on the Ukrainian side are Ukrainians. The people who have been getting killed on the Russian side are 99% Russian, though they have had some help from Korea, North Korea, from the Chechens, it is reported, and they have some mercenary troops. So one is the land part, and the land swap part, I think, is broadly agreed. The second thing that Putin must have asked for is that Ukraine will not be allowed to join NATO now or any time in the future, and a guarantee to that effect. It can join EU if it so pleases. That I don't think the Russians object to. Now, what Trump will probably do is take the outcome of this meeting, which wasn't a wrangle, because even though they had anticipated a 7-hour meeting, it ended in 3 hours. I think Trump is going to take the proceeds of this meeting and inform NATO, that is, all the European allies who are in this fight, as well as Zelensky and Ukraine. And then he'll lean pretty hard on them to accept what has been broadly agreed between Putin and Trump. That is why I think we're on our way to a final settlement and the end of this long and bloody war.
Gautam,
Thomas.
thank you very much. Do stay with us. We're also joined by Daniel Boardman, who's a senior correspondent for the National Telegraph. He joins us live from Toronto, Canada. Daniel, as always, pleasure to have you on the program. Daniel, all eyes were on Canada, were on Alaska last night, apologies. We were pitched a ceasefire deal, an end to this bloody long three-year war, which how Gautam has put it. However, that is not what we got. We got positive words of affirmation from each other, from both sides, along with a decline to answer any questions from the media. Who was the winner in this press conference? In this summit? Who came out on top? And how do you analyze the interactions of both leaders and the outcomes?
Yeah, I see it slightly different than our previous guests. I see it more as a sort of push for anyone. If anyone, I think you could say maybe Ukraine wins this summit by not losing it. There were no agreements that came out of this. There was never going to be a ceasefire agreement coming out of a bilateral talk with Putin and Donald Trump. It's not going to happen. Putin personally is incentivized to keep the war going because a ceasefire benefits Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine would take a ceasefire right now because it would stop the Russian lines and all that, but the Russian economy is fully geared towards war, and any stop in the war would, cause an economic disaster in Russia. So I think everyone's kind of talking by each other, and this is all predicated on this being a meeting with Ukraine and the Europeans next week. So if you look at the signaling, I think Ukraine gets some decent signaling out of this, where they have the show of force from the Americans was good, right? The fly over the B-52s and the F-35s, they make Putin walk by the Raptors, the superior American military technology and all that. He was harassed by the free press. There was some lack of hospitality extended towards the Russian free press, the Russian diplomats. So you can get the Ukrainians can pull some clips out of there and Putin looking bad and then not having any sort of disaster deal for them. They can see that as a win. The Russians got some standard propaganda victories that they've gotten before, right? They did some, laid down the wreath. They blamed everything on Ukraine. Putin did his whole shtick about how Ukraine's not a country and bringing up historical grievances from 1,000 years ago, showing that that's the actual motivation he has for the war, not anything that he claims or other people claim on his behalf. So nothing was really accomplished because nothing was going to be accomplished. We're not going to get a ceasefire of this, but it wasn't a disaster for Ukraine. And ultimately, the more important thing at the war to Ukraine is, it was the breakthrough and now the encirclement of the Russian troops near Perovsk. I think that had far more to do on the outcomes of the war than what was discussed between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump without Ukraine even at the table or the European powers. Like, you know, you can claim it's a proxy war all you want between NATO and Russia and this and that, but it's actually a kinetic land war between two neighboring countries, and it's not going to come to a stop until there's incentives put upon Russia to force it to stop. And every day we're getting closer to those incentives as they bleed out, and you know, there's economic tolls being taken on them. But how much can Ukraine stand and hold out to bleed out the Russians? This is the war of attrition we have going on here. So without any real addressing of the situational, like, battlefield and political conditions in Russia and Ukraine, I mean, we can have our little show for the MAGA base or for us around the world, but ultimately, like, the fate of Russia and Ukraine is going to be decided in Russia and Ukraine.
Yes, Daniel, thank you for that insight. We have some breaking news.